Hey everybody, welcome to Dagish America Presents. I'm Ben Harrell, host of the podcast, and as always, I am happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about the industry that I work in. Last episode, we talked about the importance of following the integrated pest management approach when it comes to preventing pest infestations and protecting our facilities and commodities. If you haven't had a chance yet, please go back and give that episode a listen. I highly suggest it. Now, in today's episode, we'll be discussing one of the most common tools we use out of that proverbial pest control toolbox, ultra-low volume fogging applications, or otherwise known as ULV fogging applications. And to help us today, we've invited Bob Warren, Product Support Coordinator at Dagish America, to join us. So please help me welcome Bob to the podcast. Bob, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Ben, and yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. I can't complain. So I know, Bob, you've been on the podcast numerous times at this point, but for anybody who may not have had an opportunity to find out about you, if you could just start out by telling us a little bit about yourself, that'd be terrific.
All right. Well, I've been in the business coming up on a grand total of about 35 years. So I've been in the pest control industry, like I said, for 35 years. Done everything from being an applicator, working trap lines and all that, to manager. Have been licensed in many states throughout the years as an applicator. And currently I am licensed, I believe, in 4 states now. And just started a new position as a product support coordinator for a new line of product that we're getting ready to roll out. And looking forward to that new and challenging opportunity.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, I'm congratulations on that move, by the way, as well. I know that's, with that new product line being launched by Dagish, it's got to be pretty exciting to be working on the front end of that.
It is. It's a exciting new opportunity, and looking forward to it. The equipment is going to be phenomenal along with the product.
That's great. So today, what we're going to be talking about actually is something that's not fumigant related, but is kind of fumigation adjacent, I guess, is kind of a way to say it. We're going to be talking about ULV fogging applications. And Bob, I know you have an extensive amount of experience with ULV fogging applications. When I thought about having somebody on to talk about that, you were one of the first people that popped up in the top of my head. So I guess I just kind of want to start out because I know that, a lot of the newcomers in our industry and a lot of people that work alongside our industry sometimes get the term fumigation and the term fogging confused. And so I was just kind of wanting to start out with you kind of giving us a definition of what fogging is compared to fumigation.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree. Every time you do a fogging at a lot of facilities, they're saying, oh, well, we're fumigating this weekend. And I said, no, you're not. You're doing a space fogging. And I guess to break it down to basic terms, fumigation is obviously a product that the fumigant is something that you can't see. Whether it's a gas in gas form already, or it's in solid form and reacts with moisture in the air and releases the gas, you can't see the quote unquote fumigant gas. When you're doing a space fogging, you can see the actual material. It's in small particle size, but you can see it. It looks like what it says, a fog. And the way I explain it to customers is basically if you opened up a sprinkler system and open it up and shot it up in the air, it's going to come down in particle sizes and hit the insect and perform its killing ability. So like I said, with the fumigant, you can't see it. If you're fumigating with whether it's sulfurofluoride or phosphine gas or methyl bromide, when it's being released, you might see some dispersion there. If it's coming out of a cylinder, you might see a little bit of a quote unquote fog, but really there is no visible sign of a fumigant versus a fog, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, with it being a liquid that's suspended in air, it's just like a fog that you see rolling across like the banks. And you don't necessarily have to see like real thick fog inside of a structure to know that you're getting a good kill. You will see some misting in the air, but I think a lot of times people also think, the thicker the fog, the better the kill. That's not always the case. It's way more important to get the proper micron size than it is to actually get that real thick fog throughout the structure.
Correct. And once you have released, depending on what agent you have released, that quote unquote fog will disappear. You'll still have small microns in the air, but you won't see it as much as you would at first release.
Yep.
And so that is a thing. And that's why it's a safety issue. And I know we'll cover that later, but safety issue that you make sure that you lock and placard all your doors, because once you start the process, you can't see it. So you don't want people in there. If they didn't have respiratory protection on or something, you should be able to smell it. But again, you can't necessarily depend on seeing it after a period of time goes by.
Another interesting thing in the difference between fumigation and fogging is that, fumigants are gaseous in nature. And so they have the ability to penetrate through a lot of different types of products, product packaging, commodities themselves. So you can actually get penetration oftentimes down into the center mass of the stored products that are inside the structure. But with fogging, because it's that liquid that's suspended in air, as soon as it hits a surface, it's going to stop. It's not going to be able to penetrate down into that commodity or packaging very well. So if you have insects that are down in the center mass of that product, fogging isn't really going to be able to kill those insects at that point. But it does a fantastic job of being able to kill everything that it does come into contact with.
Correct. And that, like I said, the fumigant moves wherever there's space. It will go through center block and go through wood. Again, we're talking about fogging versus fumigation, but the fumigant does penetrate where a fogging agent does not.
Yep.
If you've got a problem in product somewhere, then you definitely need to do a fumigation treatment versus a fogging. The fogging is more, like we say, a space fogging. It treats the space.
Yep, absolutely. So what kind of different types of fogging chemicals or fogging insecticides are available on the market right now?
Probably the two that are used the most is pyrethrin or pyrethrum for food plants and all types of applications, warehouses and everything along those lines. And then you've got Vapona, DDDP, dichlorovos is the chemical agent. But everybody, for years since I've been in the business, everybody calls it just Vapona. The difference between the two is Vapona has a higher vapor pressure. It will move more readily in space than a pyrethrin. And I used to tell my customers that they would say, well, what's the difference between a pyrethrin fogging and a Vapona fogging? My example was, I would say, like take a garden hose with a sprayer on the end. And if you open it up and shoot it up into the air, it's going to settle down. And if I've got for example, a table sitting in the middle of a warehouse and there's no air movement, that particle sizing of that pyrethrin is going to go up and will eventually settle down. If there's a table or a pallet or something that's blocking, you won't get that agent coming in contact with an insect that's there. So if there's insects under that, for example, that table or a tent, you're not going to get product to that area. Where Vapona, it's higher vapor pressure, it will move readily through airspace. Now, it doesn't penetrate like a fumigant, but it's as close to a fumigant as you can get. It will move through, if there's spaces in between pallets, it will move there. It will move under equipment where, like I said, pyrethrin just goes up, comes down, and settles. That's the differences between Vapona and pyrethrin, the way that I explain it. You can fog with insect growth regulators, but a lot of people just put the insect growth regulators into the fogging agent that they're using. I had customers in years past that would fog with just a insect growth regulator, but those days I don't think really nobody does that anymore. They mix it in with either the pyrethrin that they're fogging with or the Vapona.
Yeah, I think the only time I hear about people doing that these days are in environments where using insecticides is pretty limiting. The labels for the insect growth regulators are a lot more broad than the than the labels for fogging insecticides. So there are some niche areas where I think just fogging with the insect growth regulators could be done. But you're absolutely right. If you're going to bother to fog, you're going to put out an insect growth regulator for long-term treatment, but you're going to do that in conjunction with the fogging insecticide that's going to get you immediate results.
Correct. If they're spending the time and the money, they're going to do a more advanced treatment. Like I said, mixing it with one of those agents, it's much better.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, what kind of equipment do you need to fog a facility? I would imagine that there's probably a broad range of things that you could use to apply the product, but what's some of the most common equipment that we see?
For pyrethrin and Vapona, there are cylinderized products available, meaning there is the product is put into a steel cylinder. It has a nozzle attached to it, and it releases into the space. That's for pyrethrin as well as Vapona. Now, with Vapona, I'll come back to Vapona. There was a label change last year that does not allow the applicator to be in the space that's being fogged during release. So that cylinderized portion with putting a nozzle on there is not applicable. But let's go to pyrethrin first. With pyrethrin, you can use what we call a pot fogger, which was a standard for many years. It's basically a mechanical device that has for lack of better terms, a pot that holds the pyrethrin. It's usually requires an electrical plug-in. There are some battery-operated ones, but those aren't used as much as in years past. So you've got a pot fogger that allows you to fog that space. There's total release cans. It's basically in a aerosol can. You push the top of the aerosol button on that and set it in the space and walk out. That releases the pyrethrin that's in that can. Typically, that will treat 4,000 to 6,000 cubic feet. So if you have an office space or a small lab area or whatever, you can purchase those total release cans, put those in the space to be treated, and then and making sure you're wearing the proper protective equipment, of course, and release that into that space. You would come back after a period of time, and the cans are completely empty. You just throw those away. That's pretty much it for pyrethrin. Although with pyrethrin also, you can have fixed systems where if you're fogging a facility over and over again, a lot of food plants have it. They'll have a piped in system with a central location to dispense the fogging agent, whether it be in a 55-gallon drum or a pressurized cylinder. It's hooked up to the fogging system that's ran into the building, into each area that's to be fogged. And we'll have fogging heads in those areas. Those fogging heads are set to a certain micron size to make sure that they're getting a small enough droplet size in suspension so that you get a good coverage in that area. They also have those type of systems, fixed systems for Vapona. And like I said, last year, the label changed for Vapona. So your options for dispensing Vapona now are you can have a fixed system put in that's usually stainless steel lines with stainless steel fogging heads. You'd hook up your cylinder to that area and fog it with the Vapona. Or you can run in what we call remote lines. Basically, your Vapona cylinder will be outside the fogging space. You run a line into the area to be treated, and on the end of that line, it has the fogging nozzle. So you're not inside the treated space while you're releasing. They have been, the distributors has been working on the potential for remote control release of cylinders, basically hooking a timer up with a solenoid valve on it and releasing those cylinders inside the fog space. That really hasn't come to fruition yet. I haven't seen one in operation. I know that they are working on it, but haven't actually seen one in operation at this time. Those are basically your options. And like I said, I haven't seen the remote timer application in use as of yet.
Yeah, so a lot of options, and the pot foggers, boy, I used a lot of those back in the day. Pot foggers, they were tried and true. I'd say the advantage to them is they were a little bit smaller, so they were easy to put into specific areas and maneuver around into some tight-fitting areas. You could get behind pallet racks and things like that with the pot foggers very well. One of the disadvantages for them is most designs had a dial on it to where you could crank them up really high, and that would release more product faster. In the way that they're designed, they have a fan, like a blower on them, and it dispenses and creates a mist out of the product by using that fan or that blower that's on it. But when you crank them way up, you end up with a micron size that's not necessarily ideal for whatever insect you're trying to kill, because most insects have this really short range of micron size for insecticides, because you want it to be able, you want the micron of the fogging insecticide to be able to adhere to the insect spiracles and then get down through their system in order to kill them. But if you have a micron that's too small, it won't adhere. And if you have a micron that's too big, it'll bounce off. So you have to have that kind of sweet spot on microns. Anything from like 10 to 20 microns is about perfect. But man, there's a lot of times I saw folks using those pot foggers and they'd crank them way up, and then the droplet size was so large that you weren't really getting a good kill. So you always had to be careful with the pot foggers when you used them to make sure that you didn't do that.
You did. You really needed to be careful to make sure that you calibrated them correctly. But the problem was when you had some, say, well, I won't say it's necessarily inexperienced technicians.
Yeah.
It could be experienced technicians. They were like, you know what? I want to get this job done quick. They would crank the dial up, like you said, all the way. So they're basically putting out more material quickly. They were able to, quote unquote, get the job done quicker. But all they were doing is basically putting that material out quicker. They weren't really getting a good kill because it needs to be a certain, like you said, that certain micron size has to be there in order to get the proper kill. So that was the drawback to those. And then, like I said, also the drawback was if you were doing a large space if they were electrical, you had to walk around with an extension cord.
Yeah.
And then you had the push carts that were gas operated. Again, those had dials on them where you could set the micron size. Usually people were in there with Tyvek suits. And if you're in a Tyvek suit in the middle of summer, wearing a gas mask and all the protective equipment, they wanted to get out of there quick.
Yeah.
So they would crank it up and put the product out probably faster than really was efficacious.
Yeah, and that micron size is important for another reason too, being that if the larger the micron size, because again, this is a liquid that's suspended in air, so the smaller the micron size, the longer it will kind of float in the air, and the farther out it will float in the air, the smaller the micron size, so you can actually get better coverage. But if you crank them all the way up and you have that really large micron size, think about the difference between, like fog and how fast it drops compared to rain. Well, the micron size of rain, like a drop of rain, is really large. So the higher the micron size, the faster it's going to fall to the ground. So you may end up only having a spread away from the fogger, depending on the micron size. You can have a spread that goes out several hundred feet, or you may only have a spread that goes out several feet. We always called them grease spots on the floor. It wasn't really grease, but if somebody turned a fogger up too high and they had it pointed in the wrong direction, all the fogging insecticide would fall directly onto the ground, and then you'd end up with this big wet spot in front of the fogger. Well, that's not doing any good because you're not killing anything. You have to keep it in the air as long as you can for it to come into contact with those insects.
Correct. You want a good hang time, basically.
Yep,
and
exactly.
And that was the one thing when you were doing a pyrethrin fogging, you really wanted to be able to fog it and let some time go by and be able to look in there and actually see a fog.
Yeah.
That was best. But if you fogged it and walked out and 15 minutes later you turn around and look back in there and you don't see anything, you probably didn't have the micron size set right, because you want that hang time to where it gives that cloudy appearance, and that has more it's more efficacious, and you're going to get more of a kill.
Yeah. And I have to say, I really like those built-in systems. It takes a lot of that potential for error out of the equation. As long as your lines are clean, and as long as you're doing periodic maintenance on your nozzles, wherever they're permanently stationed inside the structure, as long as you're doing that, you're going to get that micron size pretty much the same every time that you apply the product. So there are some huge advantages for built-in systems, but there's a cost factor associated with that too. It costs quite a bit of money to have built-in systems put in. So if you're only fogging maybe once or twice a year, a built-in system may not be the best option depending on the circumstances. But if you're fogging, there's places out there that I know of that fog, once or twice a month. And in those situations, it may be very advantageous for them to install a built-in system, because long-term, they're going to end up saving money in the long run on labor.
Yeah, and that's something that and I don't know if a lot of people know that Dagish offers. We will provide quotes for installing fixed systems. And again, there's a fine line there. If you're only fogging once or twice, or you're having a outside service do it, it doesn't make sense to put a system in yourself. But a lot of food plants, a lot of warehouses, that fog themselves and do it on a regular basis do want the fixed systems because they do cut down on labor. They improve safety, actually, because you're not inside, you're not doing anything, handling anything. And it gets that, especially if you're using pyrethrin, it gets it up high already. So you have your micron size is set by your fogging heads, but also you're up at a high level. So it's basically putting it up high, and it's able to dissipate downward and come in contact with more insects. The benefit of that is, and especially if you're using Vapona, if you these large facilities that are fogging with Vapona, where in the past, like I said before the label change, you could put if you were using cylinderized product, you could put the cylinders out in there fairly quickly, walk through with your safety equipment, open the cylinders, and get the job done, get the product out pretty quick. Now with these remote systems where you have to run the lines in and everything, it can take several hours to get the remote lines put out and then brought back in. So if you're on a time crunch, a fixed system is really the way to go. But again, they can be expensive. You just have to do the math and say, okay, what's my goal here and what's my bottom line? But if you're fogging on a regular basis somewhere, I love the fixed systems.
Yeah, I agree. I've used several of them in the past, and I mean, it's such an easy way to fog with the least amount of labor involved. So, I mean, there's a lot of labor getting them set up, but once they're set, maintenance is easy and application's even easier.
Yep, totally agree.
I know that anytime that you're using any kind of an insecticide inside of a facility, you have to be very conscious of the surfaces that insecticide may come into contact with. So with that being said, fogging insecticides are insecticides. I'm sure there's some preparation that has to be thought about before you actually start fogging the facility. What are some of those preparations that have to take place?
Well, yeah, you obviously, first and foremost, you can't have any open food product. So let's say that you're in a mix plant and you've got a large vat of, we'll say, cooking mix that's not being used or whatever at that time. Any open food products have to be either covered or removed. You can't have obviously any insecticide or pesticide come in contact with the food material. So that's first and foremost. The other thing is obviously each label will tell you where you can and cannot fog, such as Vapona, you can't use in a frozen dough facility or an egg facility. So you always have to follow what the label states on there for the do's and don'ts. All the fogging agents will say that prior to fogging, any food contact surface must be covered prior to fogging or washed prior to use post-fogging. So most of the facilities that I have done in the past would either cover their food contact surfaces, or they would, when they would come back in and when they start up, they would run for lack of better terms, they called it a flush. They would run the product. Let's say that they're making pizza crust mix. If they had any food contact surfaces that they were not able to cover, they would run a small amount of flush material through the system and throw that away afterwards. So that basically flushed all the system out. There was no potential for residue left on any of the equipment. But those two things you definitely have to do: cover prior to use or wash after. And like I said, no open food or anything along those lines there. Obviously, nobody in the building where you're fogging. No, when there shouldn't be pets, especially for food related. But no pets. If there's live plants, most of the places you're fogging don't have any of these in there. But what we're talking about is usually food plants and warehouses, stuff like that. But I had worked for a company that did service for restaurants. And they would fog restaurants, in the evenings for fruit flies and cockroaches and stuff along those lines. No Vapona, but pyrethrin. But they had a seafood restaurant that served live lobster. You have to cover the fish tanks to make sure you're not killing off the next day's food service.
Yeah.
I don't think the people that are listening to this podcast, I don't think would be doing any of those types of services, but you never know.
Yeah.
But you don't want to have a fish tank or a lobster tank or anything like that that's running a oxygen generator or anything like that in a fogged area, because you will kill those.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen situations like that in my past as well. I came from a standard pest control background before I got into fumigation, and I think you did a little bit as well. But yeah, it's you have to think about those things, especially when you're in areas where consumer contact could be a potential. So like you said, restaurants where there's seating, and a lot of times people don't think about like the fish tanks out front, things like that. And yeah, you have to think about that stuff.
Yeah. Actually, we share a former employer, so that's where I think both of us got our experience on that.
Yeah. So we talked about preparing a facility for a fogging. Is there anything that you have to do after the fogging has taken place? Is there anything extra that you should think about doing at the end of it? Like, for example, like with fumigation, you always have to do aeration. And oftentimes you don't have to aerate a facility when it's been fogged. I mean, there are some stipulations with dichlorvos or Vapona when you can do that, but usually if it's been more than 24 hours, you don't have to. So besides that, is there anything else that you can think of that you may have to do to prepare the facility to turn it back over to the customer once you're done?
Well, the one thing is you want to make sure that, because you're going to placard the facility prior to fogging, you want to make sure that after that you've aired out and ventilated that facility, or the correct amount of time has went by where ventilation is not required, that you remove all of the signs and placards. The one thing you don't want to do is leave placards up and have your customers walk through a placard. You don't want to desensitize them to the danger sign. So remove all placards once the facility is ready to be turned back over to the customer with all of the placards. If you use any total release cans or anything that's disposable or throwaway, you want to go back through and remove those and dispose of them properly. And if by chance, if you were using a pot fogger or some other piece of equipment that left, as you were saying, a wet spot, you don't want to leave anything that's going to be a slip and fall hazard or a potential contamination hazard. So again, if there's something that was not put out properly or whatever, clean the area up, follow label directions on the cleanup, obviously. If you are responsible or your company is responsible for covering prior to fogging, you want to dispose of that plastic covering accordingly. The only thing you want to leave behind is dead insects.
Right, yeah.
That's about it.
Plenty of those. You want to leave plenty of those. You want to show them you did a good job, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, hey, Bob, I only have one question left for you, and it's a question you've answered before, because I know you've been a repeat guest here because you've always done a good job for us. But this question, it's the last question. What advice would you give a new pest control operator or a new fumigator or a new fogger? What kind of advice would you give them about ULV fogging treatments?
The one thing I would say is make sure that you're reading the label. Make sure that you read the label front to back and understand that label completely. It's going to tell you the do's and don'ts. It's going to keep you out of trouble, but make sure that you're following that label. If there is a question that comes up that it's a gray area or whatever, you can always call your distributor where you get the product, or the manufacturer usually has a helpline. But make sure that you're following label directions. Make sure that you're communicating with your customer what actually you're doing. Because again, a lot of people in the industry that have been around forever, they use fogging and fumigation as a interchangeable term, and it's not. Fogging is not a fumigation. A fumigation is not a fogging. There's just so much difference. You want to make sure that the expectations of your customer, they understand everything that you're going to do for them, and what the limitations are for that fogging. It's not going to take care of anything that's in a product. Again, we talked about that earlier, but you want to make sure that they understand what you're doing for them, and then what also they need to do in preparation for the treatment, and what they need to do after the treatment is completed. As we talked about, removing open food and or washing or covering prior to use food contact surfaces. So make sure that all of that happens. And then I would say that get yourself around a person that's been in the industry, try to learn from them, not necessarily everything. They might have some shortcuts and might not properly or whatever. They can give you some worst case scenarios, I'm sure. But just make sure that you're educating yourself. Don't take anything for granted.
That's great advice. Well, Bob, that's all I had for you today, buddy. I really appreciate you taking some time and answering some questions for us about ULV fogging.
All right, Ben, appreciate it as always. And I think it's great that Dagesh is providing this to their customers and the public. It's a good educational series, and glad to see that it keeps going every year.
I will keep doing this as long as they let me. I really enjoy it.
All right. Well, take care, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Bob. I want to thank Bob for helping us learn a little bit more about ULV fogging. When used properly, fogging can be an extremely useful tool in the control of stored product pests. On the next episode of Dagesh America Presents, we're going to be talking about another very important aspect of that IPM approach, sanitation. And remember, if you have a question you'd like for us to answer, please feel free to email us at podcast@dageshamerica.com. You can also find us on our website at dageshamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. Till next time, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.